Ryan, welcome to episode 3 of the Ask Anything podcast. We're excited about this one. It is officially fall out, and compared to the first podcast, it is sadly raining outside. Clouds are overcast, and so we're here. But we are up in your office, enjoying the coziness of what this room has to offer us. And we're going to jump right into a fun conversation on male and female roles in leadership.
Yep.
It's heavy. Where should we start with this one?
Probably some important things to frame the conversation for people. I guess I have a few thoughts just from the outset. There were lots of questions on this. I think 12 or 13.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a very, very sensitive subject in light of our culture, in light of diversity, equity, inclusion, emphasis in all sorts of areas of our culture. This conversation is important to so many people because 50% of us are females and the other 50% are males.
Yes.
So obviously it's a sensitive subject and a very important one. Lots of questions on it. I also think there's a lot of confusion on this subject because our culture is significantly slanted in a certain direction to such a point that it almost feels unfathomable and even like just super horrible that the church wouldn't hold exactly the same views as culture. I think on this particular issue, not quite as much, but this is similar on the issues of general sexuality. So homosexuality and transsexuality and all other definitions or expressions of sexuality. These subjects of gender and sexuality are very, very uncomfortable because our culture is screaming so loudly that equality has to look like identical expressions. So any sort of uniqueness in this becomes dismissed as oppressive. So it's a very, very tough subject. The Bible, though, speaks to, I think the thing I want to say at the beginning of this is there are lots of Christians who have slightly different views on this subject. I mean, I have and so do you, like a breakdown in front of us. Yep. There's patriarchal views on this subject, which we'll talk about. There's strong complementarian views. There's moderate complementarian views. There's soft complementarian views. There's moderate egalitarian views. There's strong egalitarian views. And there's feminist views on these subjects, and they all intersect and interact with functions of role in the home, in the church, and outside in society.
Yeah. So just to help the listener, if you're not looking at the same chart that we're looking at, what we have is kind of 7 different, would you say, would lanes be the right way of looking at that? Kind of your lanes?
Yeah. And I think I think there's problems on the ends of these.
Yeah.
What I would suggest is there's problems on the poles of these views that I think we should steer away from.
Yeah.
And again, not for the sake of just being moderate, but I think that the challenge is the reason why people land in whatever lanes they landed in between the two poles in Christian doctrine of like third wave feminism, not first or second wave feminism, because there's been obviously a lot of oppression and misogyny of women historically in the world, and even still in vestiges of our own hearts or our own society, in our homes and our families. But third wave feminism is, in my estimation and from my perspective, not exactly the same thing. This is maybe not just looking for equality, but recasting. And it belongs really connected to a lot of our thoughts from last week related to critical theory.
Yeah.
Gender and queer theory and feminist theory is connected to the larger postmodern critical theory moment. And so on one hand, there's some important subjects about male and female leadership and male and female equality and male and female function that we need to, I think, reform and grow in. But there's also needing to be a recognition that there are voices today championing feminism that are absolutely coming at it from the element of wholesale adoption of postmodern thought on self-constructed identity, fluid gender, fluid sexuality. In fact, it's many people who hold those views. I gotta turn my beeper down. Many people who hold, I don't actually have a beeper. That's like what, 2006 or 1997? Were you born then?
No.
I didn't think so.
No.
So beepers, Sean, were these things you used to have that you put on your belt, and they go beep, beep, and then they'd show you a number for someone that wants you to call them.
That's called a pager.
Oh, is that called a pager?
That's called a pager. Doctor has those.
Yeah, well,
anyway, we digress.
Yeah, obviously I wasn't born then either. So anyway, okay, all that to say, I just think that this is very sensitive. So I get that. Hence, there are so many questions about it. People get very frustrated about it. And I also understand that because I think there is particularly for females, feeling like if there's things that are restricted, it can feel like that makes me feel angry or slighted or not recognized or not valued or not cared for. So I guess I'd start here. The biblical vision for male and female value is grounded in the Imago Dei. It's grounded in the image of God. So
page 1 of the Bible.
Yeah, Genesis 2. God made humanity, male and female. Yeah. He did not make humanity broken. We like to make a joke. Preachers make jokes about this, but I think it kind of backfires, quite frankly. It's kind of like God made man, then he needed to do better, so he made woman. That's actually a self-deprecating falsehood. It's built out of the idea that men have been so misogynistic and dominating, which is absolutely a prevalent sin of men and our history. But what we then do is we denigrate the image of God in men in order to, like, you know, women are so awesome. It's basically to overcome a deficit, we overreact. And I know it's like tongue in cheek, it's a joke, but the reality is no, God didn't make Adam and go, oops, I could do better, and then make Eve. God made Adam and then realized that expression of his image encapsulated in sexuality wasn't good on its own. So he made an equal and complementary sexual counterpart, also made in his image, and called her female. And so the question that rages from a theological perspective, and people in our own church are divided on this issue, not I hope in community, but in difference of opinion. The question becomes, when God made Adam and then made Eve, did that order matter for any sort of functional leadership or role for the sexes, period? So in egalitarian, and that's a large group of views, but it would generally say no, God making Adam, then Eve, that order has nothing to do with role and function. It just happened to be. A complementarian is going to say, though equal, and that egalitarian would affirm the same, they're totally equal, but their role in the home, church, and the world are totally identical. Okay? A complementarian is going to say, no, they're totally equal, but their roles in the home, church, and world are different. And then there's gradations. At the far extreme is patriarchalism, which essentially is like in the home, they're totally different. In the church, they're totally different. In the workplace and society, they're totally different. So a patriarchal view, which I do not hold, would be like, we can't have women CEOs, we can't have women presidents, we can't have women whatever. A complementarian view would say, in culture, that's totally fine. In the church, there should be roles as it pertains to headship and leadership, and in the home there should be roles with headship and leadership.
So what you're saying is there's 3 domains in which we operate. There's the roles in the home, roles in the church, roles in the work.
Yeah, roles in the world. Yeah, society. It doesn't have to just be work, but society, out like larger civilization and society. And so patriarchalism, which I would reject, says they have to be different, and that puts men over women in all those scenarios. Well, feminism at its extreme is the exact opposite. It's women over men in all those scenarios. And then you have in between, I think, 2 views that are they're very faithful to Christian orthodoxy, which is egalitarian and complementarian. And the egalitarian is just going to say, no, men are totally co-equal. There's no better or worse, but there's no distinction of role that in home. So I should take that back. Some egalitarians think there's distinction in home, but not in church and society. And there's some that think that there is no roles difference in home, church, and society. Then you have complementarians, some of which think there's differences of roles in homes, but very moderate differences in the church and no differences in society. And then gradations even more conservative. So differences in the home and differences in the church, and similar but somewhat difference in society. And all the way up to patriarchalism you go. And so the reason why this is such a hard subject and why people ask such pointed questions and they get so frustrated is because we live in a world that is unashamedly feminist. The prevailing culture, at least. The loud media shaping culture. Maybe not a lot of people's practices or how they were raised, but the emerging culture is feminist. The receding culture is probably patriarchal. And we're then left to figure out, where are we in the middle of this? And I think the tension is, are we going to allow the Bible to shape and speak to this or not? That's the first question, because a lot of people just don't even do that. They just go, well, the culture doesn't do that, so it feels foreign. The church would do that. And then the other thing is, are we going to be charitable within the church? Because not everyone in the church sees these issues exactly the same. And that's where it gets very, very difficult. And that probably leads us to some of the questions people ask. Like, well, if are men and women equal? First of all, do women have gifts to contribute just like men? Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to answer some of those questions that were on the website. Like, does God want, do we value, do we cherish women's insight, perspective, and giftedness? Absolutely. That should be true in the home. That should be true in the church. That should be true, in my opinion, in greater society, because the Imago Dei is the driving doctrine there. Mm-hmm. And I think you just want to stop there and say, well, then why is there any consideration for anything else? It has to do with like 7 scriptures, probably. It has to do with Genesis 2, an order of creation. It has to do with 1 Corinthians 11 and headship. God is the head of Christ. Christ is the head of man. Man is the head of woman or his wife. What does that mean? And the word that's used there is kephele in the Greek, and that means head or authority. Some have argued it means source, but you have to go into the whole text, try to figure out what does that mean. Either we're stuck throwing these verses out and just going with the general prevailing cultural view, or we have to wrestle them down and figure out what in the world Paul in particular is talking about. That's 1 Corinthians 11. You also have questions about this issue in 1 Corinthians 14. About submission in the church, and Paul talks about that. So then you also have this subject in 1 Timothy and requirements for being an elder. Yeah, those are used as male. Does that mean that that's what it was intended to be, the husband of one wife? Is that just circumstantial? Is that just a descriptor of integrity, or is that actually speaking to sexual reality, like gender? You have the same prescriptions in Titus. You have the very uncomfortable text in 1 Timothy 2, 12 through 15, where Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. For after all, Adam was made first and then Eve. Right? So his argument appears to go to creation order, not culture. Oh, dude, mess. Let me just level with everybody listening. This is an opinion I've had ever constantly changing and wrestling views on. Probably all of my ministry. And I want to say, my hope is that I am only operating out of this based on where I feel the scriptures confine and light the way, and not out of some sort of cultural reaction, because I do realize how uncomfortable and how frustrating this feels, I know, to so many women who are like, yeah, but you don't even have verses in the Bible that have to be wrestled with that say things like a man can't. Right. And I'm like, I understand that. I feel for my sisters in that regard. Personally, for me, just my position on this is I affirm women, their gifts. I affirm women in ministry. I think women should flourish in ministry. I don't have a problem with women serving on a church staff. I don't have any biblical theological issue with the woman working full time in the church, outside the church. I don't have a problem with a woman making significant money for her home. I do think that if a woman decides to have children with her husband, that motherhood is a seriously high and cherished calling, and it shouldn't be brushed aside as if it doesn't matter. And many women make very unique and important decisions about that season of their life. And I think they should, with the freedom they have with their husbands on deciding how they're going to navigate that, and how they're going to split up those roles in the home and raise children together. I would say my only reservation is I do think the Bible, my current interpretation, the Bible does seem to me to have a positive, prescriptive teaching on male headship. Now, that's what makes me on the chart either a soft complementarian, or the sad part is, as I look at complementarians today, I find most of them were frustrating. I don't actually like a lot of complementarians. So I would say maybe I'm like a soft egalitarian. I'm somewhere in that camp. I think for me, the challenge is I don't think when Genesis 3:16 says, your husband shall rule, you will long to rule over your husband, he shall rule over you. I don't think male leadership is exclusively, male headship, exclusively an aberration or a consequence of the fall. I think it's a created order. And I think that's why Paul refers to it as such in 1 Timothy 2. I think that's why you see Jesus selecting 12 male apostles. I don't think that's just culturally conditioned. Again, Jesus lifted women to the exact worth and value they have. Jesus commissioned women to preach and share the good news of his resurrection when he first told them in the garden. Jesus had women who followed his public ministry and prepared places ahead of him and actually financially supported and enabled him to do ministry. That's in Mark chapter 8, by the way. Lots of things people don't really know are in the Bible. Like women are fit, capable, and able to serve and lead in ministry. That's not a question. I think this thing I wrestle with is how do you synthesize what I think the Bible also supports, which is male headship, with the clear and obvious truth: women are called, capable, and equipped to lead in ministry. How does that work? Male headship and women unleashed and equipped to serve in ministry. So my goal is to try to express that in the middle squishy place of how you do ministry in a church. I am not opposed to, some of these were questions, I can just remember them because they were obvious. There were so many of them on the, like 12 of them. Can women preach and teach? I think they can. I think the challenge, you'd say, well, you're avoiding 1 Timothy 2:15. Man, 1 Timothy 2:15, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. I would just note for people that in that section of scripture, the Greek word that's used for exercise authority is authenteo, and it's the only time in the entire New Testament that word is used for authority. And it indicates, by definition, usurping authority. So I think what Paul's saying there is not women can't ever teach or they have nothing to say. I think what he's saying is I do not permit a woman to operate in a headship capacity as it pertains to teaching over men, because I think he's advocating male headship, which he references in the next sentence, the next verse, when he says, after all, God made Adam first and then Eve. So I think order is what he's referring to, not if she has something to say or if she can speak or if she can teach. Also, we should note that a handful of verses prior to that, he tells women to learn. Paul says, let women learn in all submissiveness. Well, learning is good, and it's what makes you capable to teach. So to me, I don't think I struggle with that. I don't struggle with the woman teaching. I would not be uncomfortable with that. I think that I don't struggle with the woman teaching me. I think the difference is if a woman is to operate in a teaching capacity that is defined as headship in the church, that I think that's the only thing that Paul's raising a flag over. This is very debated, though. There's plenty of egalitarians that would listen to what I just said and say, no, Paul's only referring to some weird, out of bounds, obtrusive, dominating female who's trying to shut up the leaders in the church because she's been influenced by a cult of female goddess worship cult in Ephesus. And this is what Paul's dealing with Timothy, and that's the cultural backdrop. And there's many who posit that theory to interpret 1 Timothy 2, 12 through 15. I think that's the section, if my memory serves me well. And maybe, again, for me, I look at Genesis 2, I look at Jesus' selection of 12 male apostles, I look at 1 Corinthians 11, I look at qualifications for overseer, bishop, elder, episkopos, presbyteros in the Greek language, and that being a male office. I look at language in Ephesians 5, which I think is just, to me, another hard place to just allow the full cultural feminist view to run, where it says, husbands, you are the head of your wives, just as Christ is the head of the church. So it's just as. So it's a comparative analogy to Christ and the church. Well, Christ is clearly the head of the church, but he lays his life down for the church. And I think one of the reasons why this is unpopular and why we struggle with this and why we can't figure this out, and it feels just like, Paul and the Bible are so antiquated and so anti-feminist and so patriarchal and so nasty. I think the reason we struggle with it is because the culture defines headship as privilege, power, and exploitation. You want, in our culture, you want to be the head because you want the benefits. The Jesus way is to be the head means you take the responsibility. And you lead the way in service and in death. So Jesus' invitation to men is not more power, it's more service. And the part that's hard about this is I know there's women listening to this think, Ryan, we're so disappointed in your answer, because they're going to say, that's not what we see. And to that, I would say that's the challenge, right? That we're all broken people and we are constantly needing to be reformed and repent and be remade into Christ's image and to be remade into his vision for our sexuality, both male and female. And the other thing I do want to just say is the worldview I'm describing here, which is the worldview that I hold, there is some soft view of roles for males and females in the home and the church. Oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. It was a really good thought too. Bummer. That stinks. I've just been on a roll, but I had it too. I had this like helpful thought on it. It had to do with reforming We need to reform. We don't do it perfectly. I know what it was. It is this. It is not biblical to have a vision of male headship that doesn't also submit.
Yeah.
Men submit.
Yeah.
Men need to learn to submit. And I think that's the thing that frustrates me is I'm like, I am a male and I submit. I practice submission. There's other men I submit to. There's certain situations where I'm submitting to a woman. I don't think any of that threatens my concept, what I think is a biblical order and creation design of male headship.
Yeah.
I think God gave male headship for the flourishing of men and women, not for the detriment. Yes, because we're broken, we've constantly got to ask the Lord to help us to make sure that whatever male headship looks like, whatever it's expressed as in the church, it looks like the flourishing and equipping and empowering of women to be utilizing the giftedness that God has given them. That I think is important. And so we're trying to grow in those areas. So for me, an example, we have an elder board at Trail Church and men serve on that team. And for me, if that's not the case, you could ask yourself a question, where is male headship then? Is it only happening in the husband-wife relationship? And that's how some would answer the question. But I also am willing to constantly ask questions about that. Like, how can I get more voices to interact with that leadership table that are women's voices? And I think we're wrestling with that right now, to be just transparent. We're wrestling, trying to figure that out because I recognize that. Like, I don't make decisions in my marriage without consulting my wife and working together with her for her perspective. And so I think the church has areas to grow, this church, True Hope Church, to get better in those areas. But again, to answer my view and kind of what people feel at True Hope Church, I'm pro women in ministry. I want women to get equipped. I want them to be trained. I want them to be credentialed in ministry. I'm fine with all those things. I want women to lead. I'm okay with women teaching. I want to continue to provide those things and set those examples. I want to grow in the capacity to make sure we're learning and listening from women, not just men in an echo chamber. At the same time, I think male headship, when operating like Jesus calls it to operate, it is for the protection, flourishing, and good of all the church.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to hold on to that. I am willing, and I have been, trust me, if anyone knows me, studying, reading for years, wrestling through this, trying to come to a place of like, Lord, give us your mind on this subject. Because on the one hand, outside the culture screaming, you're not providing, you're oppressive unless everyone has the identical role. And that's why we have so much gender fluidity and non-conforming anything. And that's a radical other view. It's not the kingdom view.
Yeah.
And yet there is also the other side, which is this male-dominated, patriarchal, misogynistic dismissal of women that you don't see Jesus do or demonstrate. And even though there are traces of that in elements of the Old Testament, I think for sure, and in parts of the New, I think the huge question everyone has to wrestle with, Jesus is our model. Why in the world did he pick 12 apostles who were men instead of a woman? And I know that I've debated this with friends. It's like, well, because he was bound by cultural reasons to do so. Really? He upended every cultural restriction. He was launching the kingdom.
Yeah.
So you either have to say he just didn't want to, or he was waiting to do it later, or I just think it would have been really significant. And I've heard some good rebuttals to that, by the way. I know this is a podcast where those who would oppose my view don't get to push back on me, so I'll push back on myself. One answer to push back to that view is when Jesus was selecting the 12 male apostles, he was more thinking about the fulfillment of the 12 tribes of Israel than he was male headship. He was thinking about the 12 sons of Jacob, and that the church reconstitutes and is a prophetic fulfillment, a recapitulating of that promise into the church era and age. And that's a pretty good answer, right? So I would say I hold all this really loosely. Yeah. Honestly, I absolutely reserve the right to change my mind. I do. This one is way, way too sensitive and too squishy and not as clear as like everyone wants to imagine. I think egalitarians think the Bible's just eminently clear in the New Testament that it's the only view you could possibly have. And there's just no strand of another view, because if you hold that view, you're just capitulating to old school patriarchal culture and you don't see where Jesus was taking everything. And then I think that's errant. And I think the other thing is complementarians, or even worse, patriarchalists, think it's as clear as day as well. And they're not willing to honestly admit, nah, dude, it's a little bit squishy and very hard to discern. So I would just ask for charity, grace. I want to be pro women's gifts, their voices, their involvement. In our current construct, we have a male elder board, and that is the only team, the only ministry expression that is specifically for men. And that is my expression of how male headship demonstrates itself in the church. Everything else I want to be is empowering and equipping to those who are called and capable, male and female alike, in every expression of the ministry of the church. And even then, I think we can still grow, because sometimes that team can turn into an island unto itself.
Yeah.
And it needs the perspective and voice of women. But I think there's a way to create that without having just to throw male headship out.
Yeah.
Because I think I need someone to help me. Maybe someone's out there.
Yeah,
I still think it's a biblical doctrine.
Yeah. It's a weighty subject. And my wife and I were just at a wedding a couple weeks ago. And one thing I love about it is, they're about to exchange the vows, and they're kind of going through the proceedings of explaining the importance of marriage using a biblical framework. And you get the classic line, and they say, does the bride going to submit to the groom? And of course, everybody goes, okay, yeah, like she says yes. But then almost all the air is kind of sucked out of the room for just a brief moment, because then the weight of the question, does the groom submit to Christ? Will you do that for your bride? And I think that's the question here is like, we have one side of it, which is, how do we create more opportunities and empower women in ministry, which you are pro, but two is asking the question, in our efforts helping people find their way back to God, how do men become better at submitting to Christ? And that's what you're saying here, is that it's not just a one answer. There's two people here who both have an active role in fulfilling and walking through this well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the other note I want to just make on this subject is I think we can all be part of the same church and not even agree on this issue.
Yeah, that's good.
I think that the freeway concept, which I've advocated from the inception of True Hope Church, is a helpful way to think about this. I think you can be a strong or soft egalitarian, or a strong or soft complementarian, and still be in the same church. Not everyone can. There are people who say, this is too sensitive for me, too particular for me, I cannot do that. And that's why God has a bunch of churches we can all go be a part of and be a covenant member with. But I also think it's possible to recognize that, like, not every stinking view that your brother or sister in Christ, or even your pastor, holds on secondary and tertiary doctrine, not primary doctrine, and still partner together and still grow together. We're on the same mission together. And so I care a lot about that. So I don't want someone to hear this podcast and go, if I don't think exactly the same way. There's people who are going to hear this and they're more complementarian than me, and they're more egalitarian than me.
Yeah.
I'm a nuanced guy, and I hate that people might perceive that I just try to split the middle for the middle's sake. I don't think so. I actually think I'm a really curious and open-minded person. So I tend to go, yeah, I think I can understand that from that perspective. And I think I can understand it from that perspective. The thing that settles this one for me is my current hermeneutics of the Bible. I have not found yet, and I've read at least half a dozen books, probably more, on this subject especially. I have not yet found a just significantly persuasive approach that tells me to abandon all vestiges of male headship.
Yeah.
That it just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's never a part of design from the biblical frame of mind.
Yeah.
And so for me, that becomes pretty challenging for me just to hop full blown into strong egalitarianism, which would just say there is no distinction of role or function in the home or the church.
Yeah.
Like husbands are not the head of their wives in any way, shape, or form.
For someone who is listening and they're just wrestling inside because they just heard their pastor say, well, we can disagree on things at church, and like, explain to us. And you put this in good categories. There's preference, there's dogma, and there's doctrine. Like, just unpack that a little bit further, and maybe what does this conversation, which bucket does this fit in?
That's good. I think there's three levels. There's dogma, which is single lane, to use the analogy of transportation again. Dogma is stuff we die for. It's stuff that if we lost it, we would cease to be Christian. If you take that belief out, we cease to be distinctively Christian. That's dogma. That's stuff you can't flex on. That's single lane, one lane road. If you want to be part of this church or the historic Christian faith and Christian community, you need to submit to that and walk in line with it. That's dogma. Doctrine that word literally means teaching. A lot of people don't know that. The word doctrine just means teaching. So the church's doctrine, the church's teachings on the end of the world, on sexuality, on male and female leadership, on the inspiration of the Bible, on creation, on the Holy Spirit, miracles, prophecy, gifts of the Spirit. Like, let's just go down the road. Those areas, I think every church kind of fleshes out what they are, what are their primary doctrines and what are their secondary doctrines, and tertiary, their third, doctrines, each in descending priority of order. And I think on those issues, the church has to cast a compelling vision for what I call the freeway, which basically means you need to be in one of these 2 or 3 lanes. Because to be outside of that, you'd be too far out of the fellowship that we are walking in, and it would create too great of dissonance. And so I think this is in that category. And then I think there's a last level, which is just preference, which is just stuff that you have an opinion on, or just opinions. And those you need to just absolutely realize they're yours and yours alone. So I have an opinion that church buildings should, have crosses on top of them. I have an opinion that pastors should preach in suits. I have an opinion that we should have this kind of instrumentation or music in the liturgy of the church. I have an opinion that children should not be away from their parents during the church's gathering in age-specific context, but instead should be worshiping with their parents in the sanctuary with all the adults listening to all the message. Those are opinions. There's no stop it. Those are opinions. And they're important because they're yours. But I don't find them important because they're not mine. They don't really rise to the level of doctrine. Those are not church teachings. And so these are the 3 levels we must understand. Dogma, we will die on that hill. Doctrine, we're going to fight on that hill. And we're going to, in leadership, create clarity of lanes, clarity of postures that it's acceptable to be walking together in, so there's not too much fraying of unity in that particular local body. And so what you need to do is then create ditches. Holding this view over here is out of bounds. Holding this view over here is out of bounds. So for me on this subject, I would say patriarchalism and third wave feminism are out of bounds in the church I lead. Inside of that, I think there's lanes on the freeway for egalitarianism and complementarianism, and they're different, varying expressions. And then, so dogma, doctrine, opinion. Another way to say it is there's stuff we'll die for, stuff we'll divide for, stuff we'll debate for, right? That's another popular way of saying it. We'll die for dogma, we'll divide over doctrine, because people do. And I'm just saying, and then we'll divide and debate almost in the same category in my analogy. And then opinions almost like I don't have a D word for that off the top of my head, but we'll think about it. We'll keep that in its opinion place.
Yeah, and your encouragement regarding male and female roles in leadership in our church, these are things that we can walk in this tension together with. We don't need to divide over this.
Totally. Yeah, and I know it's hard, and again, we don't really have the scope or time in this format we're delivering for me to sit down through all 7 verses and go, let's read Genesis 2 together and let's talk about it. And you can do that. There's lots of great books on it. Let's read 1 Corinthians 11 together and debate it. Let's read 1 Corinthians 14 together and debate it. Let's read Ephesians 5 together and debate it. Let's read 1 Timothy 2 together and debate it. Let's read, is it 2 Timothy 1, I think, or just qualifications for overseer, and Titus 1. Let's sit down and read those together. And then let's look through Jesus' selection of 12 apostles. So let's look at all the text. And then you can go to Romans 16 and look at all the women that Paul affirmed in leadership and in ministry who did incredible things, like Phoebe reading the Romans letter to the church in, I think it's Cenchreae. So was she preaching? Was she teaching? She was clearly ministering in a way that to me looks a lot like preaching and teaching. So I don't think you can take Timothy 2:15 and make the whole Bible dance on it. That's why I would say, because again, that would not be popular with complementarians, that I think a woman can teach in the church. But I don't think 1 Timothy 2:15 allows you to fully erase male headship. So then how do you express that? How do you be, and I feel like so in the middle on this issue, how do you express the beauty and design of, and the benevolence of what should be godly Christ-like male headship in the home and the church, but also don't restrict and keep from women things that clearly I think Jesus had in mind for them to participate in, contribute to, and give to. That's hard. We just need a lot of grace for each other.
So much grace.
We need grace for each other in this regard.
Ah, so good. Well, this has been a fun discussion. I feel like we could probably do like 5 more episodes just on this deep dive, go into all those passages of scripture, but the time just does not allow. So this is wonderful. So we'll wrap up episode 3. Any last parting words, encouragements to those listening?
I don't think so, man. The church needs men and women contributing with all that they have to advance the mission of Jesus. I think that's true, and I affirm that, and let's go after that.
Yeah. Amen. All right. We'll see you next week.